Hey there, Stefbot. First of all, I just wanted to say I really appreciate your videos. I haven't watched all of them, but the ones I have seen were really insightful. You're a very rational guy, and your views are very consistent all the way through. I appreciate your libertarianism because I enjoy freedom. And I agreed with most of what you said in that video as well. I think it's true that we should not use substances to run from reality or to attain happiness that we don't have otherwise. That's dangerous, and that is addiction. Um, that being said, though, I don't think we should totally discount the use of certain psychedelic substances for spiritual insight, for coming to have a more holistic view of the universe, coming to understand our unconscious a little bit better, psychologically speaking. I'm going to read that William James quote that I commented on your video. I think it's from The Varieties of Religious Experience. Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch they are there in all their completeness, definite types of mentality which probably somewhere have their field of application and adaptation. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. How to regard them is the question, for they are so discontinuous with ordinary consciousness. Now, what I really want to focus on is that second to last sentence there. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. Now, I know you're a very rational guy. I like to be too. But I just want to get your take on this. For me, rationality is not an end in itself. And maybe that's just my naturally spiritual perspective coming out, and you might disagree with that. I'm not religious. I'm probably an atheist in that I don't believe in the mythic conception of God the Father who are in heaven. I'm spiritual in the sense that I don't think rationality can know everything. I don't think scientific reductionism can give us truth. It can be very useful, and we can learn many pragmatic truths. But there's certain types of metaphysical truth which can only be experienced, and when they are experienced, they can't be put into words very easily because they are, in a sense, trans-rational. Not irrational, but just non-rational, trans-rational, other than rational. Because, like I said, rationality for me is not an end in itself. It is a means. And so, a means to what? A means to unity. Because if rationality is the end, the root of the word, ratio, in other words, we're comparing two halves of the phenomenon that we're viewing. We're breaking up the world into a dualism. And reality itself cannot be dualistic. There cannot be two separate substances or two separate pieces that interact but never come together. There is one universe. But to experience it as one, we can't use our rational mind because the rational mind is constantly breaking things down, reducing things to their component parts, trying to understand everything as a machine, and so on. And for me, that is useful, as I said, but it's not an end. And I think the end is the kind of insight and experience that is offered by psychedelics. And certainly there are other means of getting to that experience, whether it's meditation or contemplation or whatever. There was a study done a few years ago at Johns Hopkins University, I think, where they used psilocybin and a placebo and administered each to separate control groups. And the ones who got the placebo didn't report anything significant. The ones who got psilocybin, about 70%, 65, 70% reported having the most profound, insightful experiences of their life, quote-unquote mystical experiences, which were beyond words. None of them could describe quite what it was that they experienced or why it was profound. And you mentioned this, and that was your main criticism of these types of experiences. However, months later, the researchers interviewed the participants who reported having life-changing experiences, and indeed, they were life-changing because months later, they still reported a sense of well-being associated with their everyday activity as a result of that experience months before. Years ago, back in the 60s, uh, lots of studies were being done just like this, psychological studies, studies with psychotherapy, where the analyst would give the patient a psychedelic so that they could more quickly work through the unconscious and get uh, their therapy was more effective when the patient was in this state of almost hyper suggestibility, so that not only was their unconscious brought out, but the therapist could work with their unconscious with the patient in a much more effective way, because that's really what these drugs do. They're mind manifesting substances, and they make consciousness, which normally, when it is that normal, rational, waking state of consciousness, is rather restricted and contained within certain bounds, it becomes rather unbounded under the influence of, psilocybin specifically. And in the 60s, the late 60s, the government instituted some pretty draconian laws, and research had to be stopped. Not only was recreational use by the public prohibited, but scientific investigation was also prohibited. And ever since LSD was discovered in the 40s by Albert Hofmann, science has been very interested in these substances because they provide um, such a fertile ground for studying the nature of the human mind and consciousness. And thankfully, these studies are starting to crop up again. There are other studies using psilocybin to cure post-traumatic stress syndrome, and the studies aren't completed yet, but the early results coming back are that they are very effective, and they're actually helping patients who have tried other types of therapy, other types of medication that had no effect. And finally, these guided experiences on psilocybin are, breaking them through this the traumatic experience that they keep reliving. There's other studies being done on cancer patients who are probably going to die, and they're trying to cope with knowing they're going to die, and psychedelics are very useful for that. Um, and so to just totally discount these introspective um, experiences of insight, I don't think is very fruitful. People do gain a sense of well-being from them. And the sense of truth that you were talking about, which is really this correspondence theory of truth, which has its roots, deeply embedded in the Western tradition. It's one version of truth. In other words, the truth is when the representation of the world in my mind lines up with, the objective facts out there in the world. Um, there's also a type of truth which is just plain experientially based, and you can't quite say what it is or why it's true. What is beauty? Well, we don't know. We just experience it, and we know it when we experience it. Um, it's that type of thing. And really the only way, if you're going to be a good scientist, you have to follow an injunction in order to test whether a certain theory is true or not. And in this case, the injunction or the experiment is taking the substance. And so you do take the substance, you haven't performed the experiment, and therefore you're not really capable of giving a critique of it, or at least not a scientific one, not an empirical one. And William James had this notion, this concept of radical empiricism, which means an empiricism which doesn't just pay attention to the objective facts out there in the world that we can sense with our senses, but the internal state of our mind, which is always before our senses. We always see the world through the lens of consciousness. So to experience our consciousness first, to understand the various modes of consciousness, that is almost more important than understanding this empirical world, because this empirical world is always filtered through the mind. And so, the mind is really stage one, and the experiments required for investigating the mind are there for us. Take a psychedelic, meditate. Meditation takes 15 years though, so it's a little easier to take the psychedelic. But I encourage you to either, cannabis is one thing. It's mild, psychedelically speaking. Try psilocybin, and then render judgment upon the experience. Otherwise, you're being unscientific, I think.